Now, for the second part of the discussion of the responder, things are a little bit more different and a little bit more interesting. We're going to focus on a couple of things. We're going to focus on the GPTSentimentController and the GPTSentimentService. And they're the ones that actually get these. They do the sentiment analysis of the quotes that are sent by the client after getting it back from the message service. Before we do that, though, let's briefly talk about the structure and functionality of the reactive quote repository. So this is that R2DBC repo. R2DBC stands for Reactive Relational Database Connector, and it allows you to be able to access things in a reactive and non-blocking manner. This is the actual class, and it's a repository, so it'll be properly annotated and dealt with by Spring. It extends the reactive CRUD repository, parameterized with quotes, so we're going to return quotes. And it's got two interesting methods. We're just going to focus on one in this walkthrough, but there's two of them that are fun. First is called find all by play. And as it suggests with the name, you give it the name of a Shakespeare play, which is one of the columns in the database, and it'll give you back all the quotes in the database that come from that play. So if you ask for Hamlet or Macbeth or Julius Caesar or whatever, it'll give you back those quotes. This is what the actual SQL implementation looks like. The query, this is just the data API that gives you the nice higher level abstraction, and then it turns that into a select from the quote table where the play equals whatever we pass in as the parameter. And of course, I learned that because ChatGPT told me, so it was very helpful. This is the actual method we're going to focus on. This is find all by ID in. And so that finds all the rows in the database that contains the list of, it should say list of query IDs, not subscription types. It finds the query IDs, and that'll return a flux of those things. So it goes and looks up the query IDs, whatever they are, and of course they're generated randomly for what we're doing. And that turns out to be select from the quote table where the ID is in this list of query IDs. So you can see how Spring's data API takes these keywords that are kind of concatenated together that you write and then turns them into the corresponding SQL implementation statements. Now let's get to the fun stuff. This is the GPTSentimentController and Service classes. And I had a tremendous amount of fun the last few days figuring all this stuff out, and this is the latest and greatest stuff. So here's how this works. We have a controller, which is wired to a service, and it's got a method that you give it a mono to a Shakespeare quote minus the analysis, the sentiment analysis. So you give it a quote that has the play it's from, the quote itself, the subscription ID, and so on. And you're then going to analyze the sentiment. And of course, we make that work by putting together this message mapping annotation that says, I want to do ChatGPT sentiment analysis. And it just forwards it on to the service. Now let's look at the service. So the service is going to be auto-wired to something called the OpenAI service. And the OpenAI service is a library that's available from this guy. I think his name is Theo Canning. And you can grab it from GitHub. You can add a dependency to it to your IntelliJ project, which is what I did. So you can go ahead and bring it into your code quite nicely. And we have a responder beans class that makes an instance of the OpenAI service. So that's his constructor, and we create one of these things. And notice that you have to give it an API key. So if you go to ChatGPT and you look at the account information, if you have an account, which you need to log in, you'll see that one of the things there is generating an API key. And if you follow the menu and the prompts, you'll get an API key, and then you have to kind of scroll it away in a secret, safe place. And so if you want to run this program, you'll have to put your API key in a file called private properties. And private properties, surprise, surprise, is not checked into the GitHub repo, because that's my private API key. But all the hooks are in place to do that. And you can look at the buildconfig.gradle file to see how it goes ahead and makes an instance of this buildconfig class automatically when you run the project. So assuming that we've got the API key, assuming we've got ourselves an instance of the OpenAI service, here then is the analyze sentiment method in the service. And this is just a skeleton of the cool stuff. We'll look at the cool stuff when we walk through the code later. So what it does is it calls a method that I wrote called makePrompt, which makes a prompt, which has the quote and the prompt. The prompt says something like, please analyze the following quote from the play Hamlet or whatever, using one paragraph and no more than 3 sentences. So that's the prompt. And I could change that. I could say 10 sentences, 1 sentence, whatever. So that'll tell ChatGPT what it wants me to do, what it wants me to do on what I want it to do on my behalf. And we'll talk about the method implementation. So once you get the prompt, then you make a request, and that's something that's called a chat completion request. And then we go ahead and make the call to ChatGPT. It comes back with a response, and then we set the sentiment in the quote using the result that comes back from ChatGPT, and we return the quote back to the caller. So that'll come back to the caller, and then the caller will be able to do something with the results, which we'll see here in a second. So that's the skeletal framework of how we interact with ChatGPT. Now, be aware that ChatGPT has a few limitations at the moment. You can only make a certain number of requests to it programmatically per minute, unless I think you go on the paid plan, and I didn't have the paid plan. So I can make, I think it's like 2 or 3 requests per minute. So I'll show you how I dealt with that. But it's pretty cool, and it definitely works, and you'll see it when we run it in just a minute.